I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I've done a lot of presentations, but this one was really kind of hard for me because I grew up in the 60s, and this was a trip down memory lane, so I wandered a lot as I went through this. I learned to count from 10 to 1 before I learned to count from 1 to 10. I wanted to grow up to be an astronaut. Didn't happen. Oh well. October 4th, 1957, exactly 4 months after I was born. The firing shot in what was to become one of the biggest competitions around between the United States and the then Soviet Union. This is Sputnik, the rocket that launched us on this path. But rocketry's been around a very, very long time. The Chinese were using rockets in warfare 1300 BC. In the 1930s, there were several scientists that were working on rocketry. Robert Goddard there, Wernher von Braun in Germany, and Frederick Zander in the Soviet Union. We're all working on developing rockets. Wernher von Braun, the German scientist that developed the V-2 rocket for Germany during World War II, actually did have the goal of eventually putting a man on the moon, but the rest were taking little steps as it went along. This is the Sputnik space probe that was launched in 1957 on October 4th. That's the modified intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, that launched it into space. And this is the probe itself. That was the most terrifying sound heard in 1957. If they could launch that to orbit the Earth, they could easily plant a nuclear weapon anywhere within the United States. And you know how when you were in school you had to do those earthquake drills, duck, cover, and hold, right? We did duck, cover, and hold because we knew our desks would protect us from the nuclear blast when the Russians dropped the missiles on us. It made sense to a third grader. That was the probe that started us off on the path. The Russians were far ahead of us in every respect. This is Leica, the first creature in space, also the first death in space. The Russians had a very nice delivery system to get Leica into space. They had no way to recover her. I know, sad. But she had food and water. They were planning to euthanize her before it got too long, but apparently the heat shield was damaged in launch, and she expired about 5 hours into the flight. It was April 14th, 1958 that she finally made it back to Earth. And the capsule burnt up in the atmosphere. We had a lot of mishaps as we were trying to convert our intercontinental ballistic missiles into rockets. This is the Vanguard III missile that was launched. It made it about 2 feet up before it lost thrust, fell back to the Earth, and the fuel exploded. The Russians, shortly thereafter, launched Luna 1, 2, and 3, and Luna 1 was the first spacecraft to leave the Earth's orbit. Luna 2 was the first probe to reach the moon, and Luna 3 orbited the moon, and these are the first photographs of the far side of the moon. We had no idea what the far side of the moon looked like until this picture was taken. Because the moon always keeps the same face to us, right? There is no dark side of the moon. There's only a far side and a near side. That was science for today. Shortly thereafter, we chose the first 7 astronauts, the Mercury 7. Shepard, Grissom, and Cooper, Schirra, Slayton, Glenn, and Carpenter. And some of those names you will see later on in the Apollo mission and the Gemini missions as well. I always loved that picture. I wanted to be one of those guys. This is 1959. We haven't even gotten to the 60s yet. In April of 1961, Yuri Gagarin was the first man to make it into space. Soviet cosmonaut, sorry. And he made several orbits of the Earth before he returned safely to the Earth. The Russians beat us in so many steps along the way. We were a little bit more forward thinking in our planning for this. The Mercury Project had some specific goals that they wanted to achieve. All of these are little steps that we had to take to get us to the moon eventually. Place a manned spacecraft in orbital flight around the Earth, investigate man's performance working in space, and recover the man and the spacecraft safely. That last one's always nice to have in any type of program that you've got. Recover the man safely. Shepard, Alan Shepard, the first American in space, but he didn't orbit the Earth. It was just a suborbital flight, lasted just a few minutes, but his flight is the same type of flight that you can take on the Virgin Galactic spacecraft that is launched from Mojave, and you can do a suborbital flight. I think the going price is $200,000 a ticket. I'm accepting donations to go if anybody wants to send me. And the important part, recovering the man safely. We chose to do all water landings rather than the Soviets that chose to land their spacecraft in the steppe region of the Soviet Union. We figured the ocean was easier to hit. That's the Mercury III spacecraft recovery. And you can see the capsule down here in the lower right corner that will then be taken up. And you can see a lot of these spacecraft actually on display in museums around the country. Then in May 1961, President Kennedy, in a joint session of Congress, set the goal to the moon. The Soviets will tell you that the moon was never the target. That's probably because we won. Quoting Kennedy, "First, I believe that this nation commit itself to achieving this goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. We propose to accelerate the development of the appropriate lunar lander. We propose to develop alternative liquid and solid fuel rocket boosters, much larger than any now being developed, until certain which is superior." This is the speech that set the moon as our target. Then in an address at Rice University in September 12th of 1962, he said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win." So now it's a race. The Soviets are still far ahead of us in launching rockets into space and people into space. Then, February 20th, 1962, John Glenn was the first American in space. And I remember watching this as a small child. I also grew up thinking that you couldn't launch a rocket into space with a man in it unless Walter Cronkite was present. He was the newscaster at that time, and he was there announcing every single one of them. That's where he coined that famous phrase. I don't know if you've heard it or not, but as the rocket was beginning to lift off, he said, "Godspeed, John Glenn." Some of you might have heard that. He orbited the Earth 3 times before he splashed down in the Pacific. 1963, Russians were the first to send a woman into space. Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman into space. We didn't have one until the mid-'80s when we were launching the space shuttle. The Mercury program is going on, taking these little steps at this time. The Soviets, hearing that we were about to embark on a 2-manned capsule, decided they would beat us and launch 3 men into space. In order to do that, they took a 2-man capsule, stripped it bare, put 3 uncomfortable chairs in there, removed all the safety equipment, all the backup oxygen, their emergency parachutes, everything, just to beat us. Also the ejection seats. Shortly thereafter, the next launch, in March of 1965, the Soviets did the first spacewalk. They had not actually tested their suits in the vacuum of space or in a vacuum chamber. And so when he exited the capsule, his suit expanded to the point where he could not get back into the capsule without releasing most of the air in his suit. So just a minor little glitch. And this is the first spacewalk. We are getting ready to launch our Gemini project. The Gemini project also has some modest goals: to subject man and equipment in space for 2-week periods, to rendezvous and dock with orbiting vehicles, which will become necessary in the Apollo program, to perfect methods of entering the atmosphere and landing at pre-selected points on land. They did perfect this, but we never actually landed one on land anywhere because it was cheaper and safer, they thought, to land them in the Pacific. Both the Gemini and Mercury missions were launched on top of ICBM missiles that we were designing to deliver warheads to the Russians because they could deliver them to us. This is the Titan launch that is taking Gemini 3 into orbit. And here is our first spacewalk. I thought that this would be really cool to walk in space, but weightlessness has its own unique hazards to it. In April, I had the opportunity to go to Houston and to train with NASA for a brief period of time. I actually got to experience about 10 minutes of weightlessness in their Weightless Wonder aircraft, the ones that astronauts train in. Also lovingly called the Vomit Comet, but they don't like to call it that. If you ever saw the movie Apollo 13, the entire movie was shot inside that aircraft in 30-second increments. And I thought weightlessness would be really kind of cool to do an experiment in. However, nothing stays where you put it. If you set something right here and release it, if you could release it perfectly, it should stay right there. But you can't release it perfectly. One finger stays just a hair longer than the other one. And so there it goes, tumbling off into space. And then when you reach for that, something that you put someplace else goes some other place. So it's really kind of hard to get your bearing and to do what you need to do while things are floating around you and while you are floating. And that was a demonstration that I had done with a slinky in space, or in weightlessness. I wasn't in space. We were only about 30,000 feet over the Gulf of Mexico. But it was really cool. Also, 2 gravities is kind of fun too, where you instantly weigh twice what you weigh right now. And the transition between the two are really quick. So you go up, and you're floating, and then they pull up the aircraft and you're heavy. And you go up, and you're floating, and then you're heavy. And the change is that quick. And if you're not paying attention, you can land on your face, which is not comfortable. Just landing on my bottom was hard enough. Here is the Gemini spacecraft. They're getting ready to do a dock in space where the two spacecraft are going to join. This is all in the same Gemini flight. Here is the other view from the other direction. This is what they're going to be docking with. All necessary in order to gear up for the Apollo missions. So far, every rocket that we have used has been a modified nuclear missile. The Mercury Redstone is what we launched the Mercury with. The middle one is the Titan spacecraft. And this is what was launched Sputnik. This is what the manned Soviet spacecraft were launched on. And this one over here is the Saturn V. It is the first rocket designed specifically for space launching people into space, not for delivering nuclear weapons to another country. And you can also see how much larger it is. At the top up here, at the very, very top of it, that little teeny rocket is the crew escape pod, basically. It takes the capsule. If something goes wrong with the launch, the command capsule where the 3 men are would separate. That rocket would fire and would launch it out over the ocean where it could settle back to the Earth. At least that's the idea. It's multi-stage. Up here at the very, very top, that's where the Lunar Module would be right behind the main spacecraft, where the men are sitting in that little cone up there at the top. This is the assembly of, it was AS-204 was the name of it. This was the very first Apollo capsule to be assembled in Florida. Unfortunately, when it was moved to the launch pad and they were running some tests, White, Grissom, and Chaffee, the Apollo 1 crew, were killed in a fire. They had saturated the capsule with oxygen, and a short circuit occurred, an electrical fire broke out, and they were killed within seconds. It took 90 seconds to get the door open, either from the inside or the outside, and so there was no chance of saving them. Here's the damaged capsule. This was our the first deaths in the space program while actually doing training, or other astronauts were killed in automobile accidents and things like that. But this was the first Apollo, and they didn't even call it Apollo 1. It was AS-204. They went back and named it Apollo 1, so it was a bona fide mission and generated the patch and all that kind of stuff. Before we launched an astronaut on any of these programs, Mercury, Gemini, or Apollo, we launched unmanned spacecraft first, several of them, to make sure the systems worked properly before we risked a man or men in space. We're now getting into the Apollo program. Each individual Apollo mission had specific goals that they wanted to accomplish. All of these goals were short little steps in order to progress slowly to the moon. Apollos 1 through 5, or 1 through 6 rather, had no crews whatsoever. They were all either dry runs or unmanned launches. We get to Apollo 7. Schirra, Isley, and Cunningham. Notice the Schirra name again. He was in one of the Mercury 7. The primary objectives of this one was to just test the command and service modules with the crew, the launch system, and demonstrate the rendezvous capabilities and recover the spacecraft. But they also did medical experiments up there. And astronauts, kind of unique, every astronaut is a permanent medical test subject. Neil Armstrong is still going back to NASA for physical examinations to see just what has happened to him, how has he aged, what types of things have occurred to him as they go on. So every astronaut that is still alive is a permanent test subject. And there's the crew getting ready to, they always do these nice shots in the spacesuits before they go up. This is the launch of the Saturn V rocket. That's an incredible thing as well to see. We are now to the point in the race where the United States has overtaken the Soviet Union, and we are now progressing with our own firsts. This is the docking of the command module with the spacecraft itself. They'll turn it around, they'll dock, because we had to, when we launched it, you had the little cone shape that was the command module that had the 3 astronauts in it. And then in the rocket itself, back in that part, you had the lunar module. And you can see the docking collar there. They would have to separate, go out, turn around, come back, dock, pull the lunar module out so the command ship and the lunar module could then progress to the moon, which would be the next step. And this is the recovery in the Pacific. What was really kind of amazing, we got real good at pinpointing these things to where there was always an aircraft carrier right near where they would come down so the helicopters and the frogmen could get the astronauts out and then get them safely back to the ship, and then they recover the command module. The command modules of the Apollo missions that survived re-entry are all, well, they all survived re-entry, but the ones that were not, the ones that didn't splash down in the ocean, the dummy shots, all the ones that were manned can be seen either in Washington, D.C., Houston, Florida, at a lot of the different places where you can, where they have space museums and things. Apollo 8. Anybody want to guess what Apollo 8 did? It went around the moon, yeah. Isn't that a nice logo with the 8? Kind of cool. Borman, Lovell, and Anders. Lovell, recognize that name from anywhere? He was the commander of Apollo 13, which we're not going that far. We're stopping at Apollo 11. But Apollo 13, in my opinion, was NASA's greatest triumph, getting those 3 astronauts. I was in junior high, and our discussions were along the lines of how were they going to die, not how were they going to get back, because we were fairly certain that it was a lost cause. And then they made a liar out of me. There's the crew. This is my favorite shot from the Apollo program, Earthrise. I've always wanted to see that personally, but I probably never will. I keep hoping. This is the shot as they're coming around the moon and seeing the Earth rise in the distance. And this was really kind of crucial because when they're behind the moon, they are completely out of radio contact. And so you've got 3 men, 300,000 miles from home, and you can't talk to them or hear from them for a span of 3 or 4 minutes. That was always the unnerving part, they said, in mission control, was when they lose contact and you don't hear them anymore. We're finally getting some decent pictures of the far side of the moon from the Apollo program. Apollo 10. These guys are the ones I really, really, really feel sorry for, because they did everything that Apollo 11 did except land. Their job was to go around the moon. Their job was to dock with the lunar module. They flew the lunar module down to within about 79,000 miles of the surface of the moon and then had to stop and come back. This is the spacewalk outside while they are, we call them EVAs, while they are actually working on docking the lunar module and testing things. Here's the lunar module in space. They called it the Spider. It's not upside down. There is no up, there is no down in space. So, oh, that was Apollo 9. This is Apollo 10. I lied. Sorry, my Roman numerals are weak. These are the guys that got to fly their lunar module. They got close. They got oh so close. And then had to turn around and come back. That's like going to Disneyland, pulling into the parking lot, parking your car, walking 1/3 of the way to the gate, okay, we're done. And then walking back. That was just downright depressing. But they all trained for that sort of thing. Here they are flying the command ship to try to dock with the lunar module. This is the same viewpoint that Apollo 13 would have had when they were trying to actually fly their spacecraft back to Earth. That was a little bit harder. This, they're just trying to concentrate on docking with the LEM. And Apollo 11, July of 1969. 12 years old, I had the opportunity to travel in a 27-foot motorhome with 7 brothers and sisters and my dad and stepmother, and we went to Florida. I was 3 miles away from the launch pad when Apollo 11 launched. You see this rocket off in the distance, and you see it ignite, and you see it ever so slowly begin to move. And then the ground begins to vibrate 3 miles away. You can physically feel the waves through the ground of that Saturn V rocket pounding the ground. Then you hear the noise, this horrendously loud roar. And even 3 miles away, you get hit with the wind. Third. That was one of the coolest things that a 12-year-old could experience. It was really something. Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. The 3. Michael Collins is in every Apollo mission that landed on the moon. 2 men would go down to the moon's surface. 1 man would remain in the command module up above. Michael Collins, the one in the middle, is the one who got to go to the moon and not land. He just got to orbit while they were down on the surface of the moon. When Neil Armstrong was piloting the lunar module down to the moon's surface, their primary landing spot was a pile of rocks. Our photographs were not good enough to see things, the size of this table. And he couldn't set down, so he had to fly the lunar module looking for another landing spot where it was clear. He set the lunar module down with 6 seconds of fuel remaining. That's why after he said his famous words, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. No, that was early. That was later. When he said the Eagle has landed, that's what he said. When the Eagle has landed, Houston said, "You've got a lot of guys breathing again, thank you," because they were holding their breath the whole way down.
Altitude, velocity, light. 8.5 down, 220 feet. 15 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet. 4.5 down, 5.5 down. 160 feet, 6.5 down, 5.5 down. 9 forward. Good. 20 feet. 100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. 5%. 185. 75 feet. That's looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. Head. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. Ready? Down a half.
30 seconds.
Forward. Just. Head. Ready? Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
The first photograph from the moon, Neil Armstrong descending the lunar module there on the left, and the first footprint on the moon on the right. This was televised live. It was the middle of the night in Washington, D.C., where I was. I was sitting in the front seat of the motorhome with a sleeping bag over my head, hiding the little black and white TV. Screen was that big. I had the little transistor radio earbud in my ear. And I watched that until they stopped televising. And it all looked pretty much like the upper left picture. Really grainy. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. They left also a plaque on the moon that said the date, and men from Earth set foot on the moon became in peace for all mankind. It was signed by the 3 astronauts and the president at the time. Here's Buzz Aldrin descending the lunar module. Now they've got a better camera outside, so they're getting better pictures. Neil Armstrong's taking all the pictures. This is Buzz Aldrin removing the science package that's going to be then placed on the moon. We left all these instruments there, and we're still getting data from some of them. The science package again. And here's the lunar module returning to the command ship for the return journey. And they splash down in the Pacific Ocean. There's the 3 astronauts are in those suits with the masks on. We didn't know what kind of things they'd bring back, so they were kept in isolation for a period of time to where they wouldn't bring back space bugs and contaminate us all, just to be on the safe side. And the Apollo 11 spacecraft, the command ship, is on display in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., the Air and Space Museum. You can go up and touch the acrylic that's protecting the heat shield if you wanted to. And for those of you who have seen the show on Fox that we did not go to the moon, these are photographs from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2009. You can see the lunar module there underneath where it says Apollo 11. And here's a close-up of that same photograph. You can actually see the 4 legs of the LEM that are out there. In the upper left, that's where the flag is planted. You can't quite see the flag. You can see the little white, it's a little bit lighter gray where the flag is. Below, you can see the instrument package that was put there, and you can see actually their footprints from where they walked to the crater nearby to gather rock samples. There were several other Apollo missions after this. This is in 1969. One more landed on the moon, Apollo 12, during the 1960s. We made the race. We beat the Russians. And the Russians will tell you it never was a race. They weren't playing. But we think of all this type of stuff. What types of things did we get out of this whole program? What types of benefits did the race to the moon actually provide you? Any ideas? Cell phones. Internet is an offshoot. This is my high school calculator. This is what they used in all the Apollo missions to do the calculations. Your TI-80 calculator has more computing power than the command ship and lunar module combined from Apollo 11. This desktop computer could have run the entire Apollo program with its computing power. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that we could actually see photographs or video of hurricanes with space satellites, GPS location, radio transmissions, your cell phone. Got a whole bunch of them here. Oh, any of you run? Any runners? With those fancy cushioned shoes that you wear when you run? They're designed after the moon boots that the astronauts took to the moon, those cushioned soles. Oh, let's see. The infrared ear thermometer, artificial limbs, heart pump, video enhancing and analysis, anti-icing for aircraft, better sunglasses, that's one that's important, firefighting gear. NASA owns over 6,500 patents on their technology, but they've never made a dime. NASA could be the one big money maker for the government, but their charter prohibits them from making any money off these inventions. NASA owns them, but they license them out to people who can make money off of them. Solar energy, solar panels, all of that type of stuff. People are making loads of money, but NASA owns the patents on them. Water cleaners. You might have seen recently that they were having trouble with the water cycling system. They're trying to design for Mars a water filtration system that can turn the astronauts' waste products into drinking water. Don't go, oh. We do that now. You flush and it goes over to the sewage treatment facility. It percolates back into the ground. We pump it back out and drink it. It's just a longer trip. In the space shuttle, it's all behind a cabinet. Okay, I mean, we purify and filter our water now. So all those types of things NASA farms out. And NASA's research base are high schools and colleges all over the country where they put out a competition and students try to develop the next technology for NASA. So it's really kind of cool. Any questions? Yes? Why don't we go to the moon anymore? Well, President Bush said that we were going to go back to the moon by 2015 or 2020, I believe, and President Obama has reversed that decision. Instead, we're going to go to an asteroid and we're going to aim for Mars. The Apollo program ended in the mid-70s. Why we didn't go back to the moon? Didn't seem to be much point. A lot of people felt that there was a lot of things on Earth that we needed to do. We developed the space shuttle and the International Space Station, which we're doing a lot of our tests in low Earth orbit now. So yes, going back to the moon is something that I would like to see. I'd like to go. Shoot, I'd even go to Mars. I don't care. I'll just go. I'll go to an asteroid. I don't care. Any other questions? Yes?
I know we're covering the 60s, sir, but however, what happened to the Challenger? What went wrong with that?
The Challenger, the space shuttle, there was a freeze the night before the launch of the Challenger, and the O-rings that sealed the solid rocket boosters, they were sealed in sections, and the little rubber O-ring that was sealing between one section and the next was deformed because of the cold, and it didn't warm up enough to expand and seal the joint. So as the solid rocket booster was burning, it burned through that O-ring, and that ignited the big hydrogen tank, which caused the catastrophic explosion and the disintegration of the spacecraft.
You mentioned the first Russian spacewalker who would have to let air out of his suit. Was he able to get back in?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry to leave you hanging. Yes, he did get back in. After they removed the air, he was able to get back into the airlock. And after that, the Russians actually used inflatable airlocks. They did not have an airlock on their spacecraft. In our spacecraft, what we did was in the Apollo and Gemini missions, they would depressurize, all the astronauts would put on their suits. They'd depressurize the cabin and open the door so they could go in and out. On the Russian spacecraft, they kept the cabin pressurized and they had an inflatable airlock, like a big blow-up tunnel that they would go in and out through. And once he got back into the airlock there, he was able to release the air from his suit to the point where he could then enter back into the spacecraft. So, yeah, the little relief valve. That's got to be a scary sound when you're in space and all your air's in your suit and you're letting it out. How long can you hold your breath? Yes?
Wasn't there a chimp that they sent, the Russians also sent?
We sent a chimp, Ham. When this got up to 60 slides, I kind of felt that I needed to start cutting down, so I cut out Ham. Yeah, we launched, and we recovered him safely. And he had tasks to do. He had to actually push buttons when lights came on, and he had to see how things, to see if things were placed properly for him to reach and that type of stuff. So it was really a test of the design of the spacecraft. And it was before the Gemini missions. Before we sent a man up, we actually sent a chimp up. And the Russians did send a chimp. They also sent, on the one of the spacecraft that went around the moon and recovered, they sent mice and frogs and a couple of other creatures just to see how space would react on different living systems. Yes?
When you were in the weightless training vehicle, 30,000 feet over Mexico, did you feel that the vehicle had an apt nickname?
Well, first of all, NASA provides you with heavy-duty medication. And the medication, they give you something that dampens your senses in your inner ear. And then they give you an amphetamine to kind of balance that off so that you don't fall asleep. Nobody on our flight got sick, but I could see where it could easily happen, because when your senses are damped, when they're dulled, when you turn now, your body tells you which way you're pointing and what's going on. When you're under that medication and you turn, it takes time for your senses to catch up to you, so you don't move fast. If you turn slowly. And I turned once really quickly and could understand why it could have the nickname of the Vomit Comet. One of the students, one of the men that was flying, decided when we were under Martian gravity that he would, let's see, try this one. No, try this one. Here we go. This is what you were supposed to see. This is the, I'm in the weightless, I turned the sound off because all you can hear is the jet engines. And I'm doing a conservation of momentum demonstration, and you can see how it tumbles. I'm strapped down so I don't float up to the ceiling. Up, there it got away from me. Now I've got to chase after it. Now it's heading towards the cockpit. I'm beginning to panic. I'm reaching for it. The flight surgeon's going for it, and I'm floating up off the ground, and they're hollering, feet down, feet down, feet down. So you can see I rolled just in time to go thump to, that was the experiment that we took with Sequoia Middle School. So that was one of mine. But you can see here in my first release here how it tumbles, because you can't release it perfectly. This is the second weightless hop I'm actually trying to do this demonstration. Oh, and there it goes again. And as we go into weightlessness, I want you to notice my face. Fat floats, and so all of it's going upward. There. Turn down the sound here. I'll see if this one will play. I also got to experience lunar gravity, and I got to experience Martian gravity. I actually got to walk across the spacecraft, or the aircraft, like I was on the moon. It was really kind of cool to walk. But in Martian gravity, we're under 2G right now. That's why we're not moving. Here we go to Martian gravity. Wait. I can do one-arm push-ups on Mars. I haven't been able to do that since boot camp. So, yeah, that was kind of fun. doing push-ups on Mars.
Between Martian and lunar gravity.
Lunar gravity is 1/6. The acceleration due to gravity on Earth is about 10 meters per second squared. On the moon, it is 1.6. No, it's 3 point something. And on Mars, it's 6 something meters per second. So it's about, Mars is about 2/3 of Earth. The moon is 1/3 of Earth gravity. Yes?
How did the conspiracy about faking the moon landing start?
Conspiracies start all kinds of different places with all kinds of different things. But there are actually NASA people who worked at NASA that said we faked it. It was on a soundstage someplace. But there's a lot of flaws in their argument when you consider the nearly 1,000 pounds of moon rocks that have been returned to Earth that we've investigated, and when you look at the equipment there. Mr. Osborne. Oh, I'm getting the you've got to go to class signal. So thank you very much. I enjoyed this.